Okay, back here in Cavalry, I want to do just a bare bones kind of example. I saw Ian, one of the Cavalry people, do a little example where he was using the offset within a value node, where he just animated one cube and was copying that over to another, but with an offset. So I just wanted to do this in the duplicator to again, just as kind of an entry-level thing, but also show you how you can take the simplest thing and really jazz it up quickly in Cavalry. It's one of the things I really love about it. Okay, so let's hold down the Option key and just create a cube and or rectangle, right? And once we create this, I'm going to hold down Option and create a duplicator. All right, so I've got a grid. I'm going to make this linear, and I'm going to make it vertical, and I almost always use step instead of fit so that I can dial in whatever the distance is between each one of the copies, right? So, I don't know. The rectangle happens to be 100 units by 100 units, so I'll be a little methodical and make it 110, right? So 10 pixels in between there. And let's make it 5. So that's the other reason I really like the step node, is because I can increase or decrease and keep that same spacing. Okay, so because I put this into a duplicator, and kind of related to this whole idea of inherited transformation, see a previous tutorial, if I want to animate this, I can, if I have the object directly in the duplicator, I can't animate and give it instructions from the duplicator, right? It wants to behave, it wants to listen to one or the other. And really when you put it into the duplicator, it wants that to be kind of at the center of the world. It wants to then put it in a system and move it. This would be kind of like the push and pop matrix that I talk about in my creative coding class, where we would want to position something at the 0, 0, and then use push pop and the transform function to move things where we want, so we can spin things accurately and stuff like that. So it's kind of a similar principle here in Cavalry. So we'll just leave the object at 0, then we use duplicator to do that, and then we'll just go ahead and animate the shape based on these settings down here. And I always think of this in Cavalry, like the top half is the individual. This is basically the transform for the object. Then we have some funky stuff in the middle that's related to the duplication, and then the individual changes that we would make per duplicate are down here. So I think this is like -1. I just put that just slightly off the screen. And if I click through here, you can see, hello, right? They're just off the screen. And I guess I did this kind of backwards, but that's okay. I just hit the little keyframe button, right, in the X channel, and then I'm going to go to frame 50, and let's just click in. Oops. Let's click in there and say 0. Oh, and let's get to the time editor, right? So you can see that, again, this is basically the visibility track for that object, that thing, and then here we can see these 2 keyframes that are set up. Right? Exciting. So it seems a little slow, right? I intentionally did that because I'm going to add animation in between here, which you'll see in a second. All right, so the first thing that's a little dry about this is that all the objects are coming in at the exact same rate, and they're all landing at exactly the same time. Anytime you have in animation a whole bunch of things arriving from point A to point B at exactly the same speed and exactly the same time, that's kind of an animation killer, right? So we want to stagger this a little bit. So again, we'll do that within the duplicator. And I'm just going to right-click, and I'm going to add a behavior, and I'll go ahead and set stagger. So you can see what's happened right now is that animation per object has been offset by a couple frames. And I'll just leave it there, and you can see it's now underneath the duplicator. If I hold down Option and bring up stagger, they're basically offset by 5 frames, right? And I can increase that, right? So I'm sitting here at frame 20, and I'm just offsetting how much of that should be there. So let's just say it was be 15. Reasonable, right? So now I'm at frame 0, and the problem is, well, it's offset it in the positive, so it moved the first duplicate forward, right? And then the last duplicate is the one that's actually starting at the original time. So whenever you use stagger, if you had a set home position, if you figure out what the spacing is that you would like, right, that looks pretty good, make it negative. So I'm going to say negative 15 frames. So what we're doing is telling the very last telling each of the copies to wait 15 frames. Actually, it's offset to this one being 15 frames, I believe, right? So again, a little, right? But it's not bad, right? We at least have it coming in and at a different time element, right? So let's go back to the animation for the duplicator, right? So we've got this position. So we've been using the time editor. I'm going to go to the graph editor, okay? And so the graph editor shows us, time and then value, or value, I guess is the best way to put that. So if this doesn't load up, like if you don't see where your curves are, if you click into the graph editor and hit F, it will frame on that selection, right? So we have a keyframe here and a keyframe here. It's moving at a constant rate of speed. I could select these and turn them into Bezier handles and curve them and do lots of things to them. This is not a graph editor tutorial, so I'm going to leave that as it is, but I am going to select that and right-click on that keyframe. And I believe to get to some of these, you have to make sure you have the beta features turned on in the preferences, which I've said in a previous tutorial. But underneath magic easing, we're going to do bounce out, right? So let's go ahead and play this. So it was slow at the beginning of my tutorial because I knew that I was going to add more of this motion. And you can see it literally just put this bounce in there. Some of my 3D animation students are like, what do you mean? They would have loved to have seen this for their project, right, where they could just automatically have these keyframes set for them. Right? So already this is a much livelier animation. Let's add just a couple other quick things to it. So if I load the rectangle again, so they're all gray, right? It's kind of boring. They could be all red if we want. But let's just go over, I have a palette already loaded here. And let's create an array from that palette. And let's just take the ID from that and drag it and put it into the color. Right? So now we get this nice, each one's kind of unique and different in the background, right? It's doing its thing. If you wanted to, I guess you could get even fancier and maybe put a random into the stagger rate for each one of those, but I'll just leave that where it's at. So we're under 10 minutes. It seems like the right amount of time for a little intro tutorial. Okay, so maybe the one thing to mention here is in this one, we didn't animate the rectangle whatsoever. We just used the duplicator to drive that. So later on in the next tutorial, I'm going to do one where I actually do animate the rectangle, but I have to do some things to get that into the duplicator and to do what I want. We'll come back to that soon.